Magnus Carlsen has been on an absolute rampage this week, which isn't really news since he's pretty much always on some kind of a rampage. What is news, however, is the way he's been rampaging, decimating the world's elite without the assistance of his most powerful piece. Yes, Magnus has been giving up his queen left and right, up and down, and before this video is over, you're going to see him do it no less than 3 times. First, against the great Alireza Firouzja in the grand finale of the recently completed Speed Chess Championship, which Magnus Carlsen won, as I'm sure most of you are aware. Next, against the 19-year-old wonderkind Denis Lazovic from the semifinal of the same tournament. And finally, against the very special opponent, the queen of his entire life, or so I would assume. It's a fascinating and highly instructive game, so you're going to want to stick around for that. But we got a lot of chess to get through, so let's go ahead and dive right in. This first game is from the 9th and final round of the 5+1 portion of the Speed Chess Championship final played in London. Magnus Carlsen is at the helm of the aluminum armada, and he kicks the game off with d4. His opponent, the formidable Alireza Firouzja, replies knight to f6, and we head straight into the heart of a Nimzo Indian, as indicated by the moves you see before you. All very well-known opening theory so far. Bishop to d2 is a tad unusual though, breaking the pin on the c3 knight, as opposed to the more common bishop to g5 with the counter pin on black's knight. But nothing objectively wrong with this. We have your standard strike in the center with d5, e3, freeing the b, knight b to d7, queen to b3, attacking both the pawn on d5 and the bishop on b4, which Alireza now defends with a5, ready to meet Magnus's c takes d5 with bishop takes knight on c3, so that after b takes c3 and e takes d5, Magnus Carlsen is not able to win a pawn with knight takes d5, without of course violating the rules of the game, not to mention the physical laws that govern our universe. What is played is c4, hitting that pawn again, knight to b6 defending, the capture is made, but no recapture just yet from Alireza. He knows that pawn's not going anywhere, so he plays bishop to f5 first, putting his bishop on its best good square before Magnus has the chance to prevent it with bishop to d3. Magnus says that's alright, channeling J-Rock as he's known to do. He puts the b to the e2. We have a4, gaining the space, attacking the queen. It goes to a3, and only now do we have the recapture on d5 by the queen. Magnus gets a rook active, targeting c7, and now a rather curious move, bishop to e6, counterattacking the pawn on a2, which Magnus would really like to hang on to, seeing that without it, black would have himself a powerful passer on a4, a mere 3 steps from promotion. So Magnus puts his rook on c2, defending, at which point black needs to come up with a plan. And the plan he needs to come up with, according to the engine, is rook f to c8, defending c7. Now this wasn't played in the game, but after white castles and the bishop goes back to f5, attacking the rook, white's not going to have a great way to double his rooks on the c-file to try to ramp up pressure on c7. Seeing that on c3, the rook could be attacked further with knight to e4, and if rook to c5, then you got queen to d6, defending c7, threatening that knight to e4. So this would have been the best way for black to keep his queen side super solid and well defended. What's tried in the game is c6, just ruling out any future rook takes c7 altogether, though creating new weaknesses along the b-file, upon which there now sits an undefended knight and a pawn that could be targeted if and when the knight moves. Magnus goes ahead and castles. The engine still wants black to put his bishop back to f5, hitting the rook, with the idea of meeting rook to b2 with knight to c4, sacrificing the pawn on b7 in exchange for some nice activity, but instead, Alireza decides to retreat his knight to d7, so that if and when the pawn on b7 comes under fire, it can be pushed to b5. Which is what ends up happening, but this plan is not without a serious drawback, and you might already have an idea what that is. Magnus goes ahead and doubles his rooks, which might look a bit odd, seeing that black's c-pawn is now well defended, but this does hold up b5 for the moment, which would defend the weak pawn on a4, thereby releasing black's rook on a8 of that duty. So it is a good restrictive move. We have rook f to e8, and now an inaccuracy from Magnus. Apparently best is to reroute the knight via e1 to d3, where it would be eyeing some very nice squares. Maybe coming to f4, hitting both bishop and queen. If b5 ends up getting played, then it can hop into b4, increasing pressure on c6. But what's played is rook to b2, just allowing b5, when if white were to try that aforementioned rerouting of his knight to d3, black would have time to get some counterplay with knight to b6, followed by knight to c4. So we instead have bishop to b4, clearing the way for Magnus's next move, which after bishop to f5 is knight to d2, adding another set of eyes to both c4 and e4, maybe anticipating the move Alireza plays next, knight to e4, which, believe it or not, is a catastrophic blunder. The engine wanted black to go full alpha male caveman by pushing his h-pawn all the way to h3 if possible, but here, after f3, knight takes d2 and Magnus recaptures with his rook, he's now threatening e4 with a fork. Alireza says that's fine, no big deal, I'll just drop my bishop back to g6, but after e4, queen to e6, and queen to c3, black must now defend his twice attacked pawn on c6. Alireza finds the best defense, knight to f6, when if queen takes c6 were to be played, then rook a to c8, skewering white's queen and rook, would give team black the W. So what does Magnus do? He just increases the pressure with rook d to c2. When after rook a to c8, adding another defender, he pushes d5, which is a winning move. And after c takes d5, you might already know why, as Magnus does now make a decision that we all knew was coming, parting with his most powerful piece by capturing the rook on c8. When after rook takes c8 and rook takes c8 with check, Alireza has no choice but to block with his knight, seeing that his king has nowhere to run. Magnus now has his choice of several crushing moves. He could take on b5, doubling up on the pinned knight, but then there's the slight complication of queen to b6 check, which, if you study the position for a moment, you'll probably realize is absolutely no problem for white. But what's played is the equally devastating e takes d5, attacking the queen. Taking the pawn would of course allow mate in 1, while taking the bishop on e2 would fail to rook to e1, defended by the other bishop, converging on e8. So what's tried is queen to e3 check, when after king to f1 we have bishop to d3, threatening a mate in 3, beginning with bishop takes e2 check. But here, Magnus finds a very pleasing sequence of moves with which he ends the game very quickly. Take a moment and study the position if you want to try and work it all out. What's played is rook takes e8 check. When after Alireza's only legal reply, queen takes e8, Magnus has bishop takes d3, giving him a rook and 2 bishops for the queen, aka a winning material advantage. Alireza pushes g6, giving his king a little lift, but now here comes the d-pawn, headed to you-know-where. We have queen to e6, attacking the pawn on a2, it's pushed to a3. Next is queen to d5, hitting the bishop, but after it drops back to e2, what, pray tell, is to be done about rook to d1, supporting the final push to the promised land? Well, h5, according to Alireza, successfully fulfilling the requirement to move. But after rook to d1, there really is no reason to continue, hence the decision by Alireza Firouzja in this position to resign the game. You could put the queen on a8, so that after d7 you can block with queen to d8, but then comes bishop to a5, and one way or another, the d-pawn will be achieving promotion, unless of course black gives up his queen by sacking it on d7. So what a masterclass by the mighty Magnus on how to give up your queen for your opponent's 2 rooks, leading to a deadly back rank pin, a winning of 2 minor pieces for your rook, followed by the pushing of your passed pawn to seal the deal. You just won't see it done any better, but moving right along to our game number 2, which, not unlike our last game, is also 5-minute blitz with a 1-second increment. Again, Magnus Carlsen has team white, and he opens with d4. His opponent, the prodigious young Denis Lazovic, responds knight to f6, and this time we head into a full-on King's Indian, with the fianchetto of the bishop to g7, allowing white to erect his dream center with e4. d6 prepares to challenge it. We have knight to f3, a kingside castling, bishop to e2, and here comes e5, per the opening theory. No surprises yet. Magnus castles, a rook finds its way to e8, threatening to take on d4, then on e4, hence the push to d5. That's an awful pretty pawn wedge, paw. Play continues a5, a fantastic move, preparing knight to a6, maybe coming to c5 at some point without getting kicked away by b4. Magnus puts his steed on e1, when after knight to a6, it's redeployed to d3, eyeballing that c5 outpost to blacks. So we have b6 supporting it further, bishop to e3, and now bishop to d7. An immediate knight to c5 was playable, but Denis is just trying to stay flexible here. Maybe the knight will end up going to b4 instead, who knows. Magnus pushes a4, gaining some space. The engine's not a fan, it liked queen to d2 better, but what does it know? Next is king to h8, Getting a little cozier in the corner, rook to a3, hoping for some kind of lateral future, which, spoiler alert, does eventually materialize. We have queen to e7, a needless weakening of the king side with h3, as opposed to the better move, bishop to g5, pinning knight to queen. Those are the engine's words, not mine. A rook goes to f8, preparing to meet queen to d2 with knight to g8, clearing the way for f5. It's all very textbook. Dennis, of course, wants to start chipping away at the base of that oppressive pawn pyramid. Maybe he can get it a bit top-heavy. Magnus puts a knight on b5. It is a nice looking square, attacking c7, tying the a6 knight down to its defense for the moment. Here comes f5, threatening to trap white's bishop with f4. So we do have the capture, the recapture, renewing the threat, and now f4, preventing f4, although allowing black to create a passed pawn with Dennis's reply, e4. Was that the best move in the position? Maybe not. Stockfish wanted knight to f6 instead, maintaining the tension. Since after knight to f2 from Magnus, everything is pretty well blockaded. White can play knight to d4 next, eyeing some light squared holes in the black position, which is why bishop takes b5 is the move now recommended for black, but instead we have rook a to e8, when again, knight to d4 is probably best, but Magnus pushes g4 instead, creating even more open space around his king. It is a pretty bold thing to do, but after Dennis's strong reply, queen to h4, king to g2, knight to e7, and now a blunderous g5 by Magnus, which would be a good move if black's queen had not come into h4, Dennis is now able to strike at that pawn with h6, when Magnus no longer has any h4 to support it. Black is of course threatening to take on g5 and then just steamroll white into oblivion, beginning with f4. So Magnus captures on h6, when after the queen recaptures, there is now a wide open file to his king. Magnus doesn't panic though, despite his now dead lost position. He just puts a knight on h1, looking to redeploy it to g3. Now best for black here is going to be to double his rooks on the open file as quickly as possible, with rook to f6, rook to g6, rook to g8, etc. But instead, we have the significantly weaker knight to g6, preparing to meet Magnus's knight to g3 with knight to h4 check. It is a cosmetically comely square for the steed, but after Magnus gets his king off of the open file with king to h2, you really got to ask, what exactly is that knight doing besides looking pretty? Next is king to h7, which might look a bit pointless on the surface, but after several sleepless nights of intense analysis, I did finally uncover the reason for it, which is that it prepares to meet knight to h5, attacking the bishop on g7 with bishop to h8, clearing the way for rook to g8. So no knight to h5 for Magnus here, though that would have been much better than the move he plays, bishop to d4, once again giving black a decisively winning position. After Dennis's very strong reply, bishop takes knight on b5, when after c takes b5, he's got bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, and now knight to c5. Leaving white's army looking slightly discombobulated, seeing that his most active pieces have now been traded off. Additionally, black's passer on e4 isn't quite so well blockaded anymore. Magnus continues with the strongest of his losing moves, knight to h5, which is especially attractive due to the fact that it gives black a single move with which he can maintain his winning advantage. Care to guess what it is? The move, not played in the game, is knight to d3, which does a number of things. It cuts off the a3 rook from the kingside action. It puts some pressure on the f4 pawn. It prevents queen to f2 to challenge the knight on h4. Now white can of course capture the knight, but this removes defense from the knight on h5, allowing black to take it with his queen, leaving white unable to defend against both pawn takes bishop on d3 and knight to f3 check with the fork. What's played in the game is not the correct move knight to d3, but rather the much inferior knight to f3 with check, throwing away the win to bishop takes f3, e takes f3, and knight to g3, after which there is no saving the pawn on f3. Dennis still has a few tricks up his sleeve though. He plays rook to e4, hitting the queen, when after the retreat to f2, he's now able to grab the pawn on f4. Magnus makes the capture on f3, and now comes knight to d3, attacking the queen, probably expecting something like queen to e2 or queen to c2, which would be totally fine and quite conducive to a draw. But Magnus is in Magnus mode, and he opts for a much more stunning option. You knew it was coming, a bold and brilliant sacrifice of her royal worshipfulness with rook takes f4. Dennis says, "Hells to the yeah, I do accept," as he takes the queen on f2. And after the rook recaptures, what do we have? Well, we have a very tricky position. White's only got a rook and a knight for the queen, but he's going to be picking up the pawn on f5, which after rook to f6 is exactly what Magnus now does, with knight takes f5 hitting the black queen, which according to the engine needs to go to g5. And without delving too deep into the tactical tule weeds of exactly why, I'll just tell you that after the blunderous move played in the game, queen to h5, and Magnus's winning reply, rook 2 to f3, if black's queen were on g5 here, then he could play rook to g6, threatening mate on g2, which would give him sufficient counterplay to hold the draw. And if you're wondering what the point of this move rook to f3 was, well, the idea is that after rook to f7, now played by Dennis, which seems to be a bit of a waiting move, b3 from Magnus, a move whose purpose you will see in just a moment, and king to h8, another move whose purpose you'll see in just a moment, Magnus now has rook to h4, pinning queen to king. When after queen takes rook on h4, his knight could recapture, defending the rook on f3 from the rook on f7, which was the reason for moving the rook to f3. So no queen takes h4 here. What's played is the much better move, rook takes knight on f5. When after rook takes queen with check and rook takes h5, we see that the engine's favorite move in the position, rook to f7, targeting c7, would not come with check, as would be the case if the king were still on h7. What Magnus plays is rook to f8 check, which is also winning, driving the king to g7 before targeting the pawn with rook to c8. Of course, this does allow Dennis to capture on d5, when after rook takes c7 check, king to f6, and rook to c6, targeting the pawn on b6, black is not able to attack white's b pawn with a tempo-gaining check, as would be the case if Magnus had not pushed it to b3. So how's that for some endgame foresight? Pretty incredible. What's played is king to e5, defending d6, so that after rook takes b6, black can begin going after white's b pawn with rook to d2 check. Magnus puts his king on g1, as opposed to g3, which would allow black to attack his pawn on b3 with check. Although at this point, even that gain of tempo wouldn't have saved his game. Apparently black lost another move in there somewhere, since Magnus's b3 was necessary at the time that it was played. But anyway, after rook to b2, rook to a6, rook takes b3, and rook takes a5, black is just one move shy of saving his game, since if he had two free moves here, he could take the pawn on h3, then get his rook back behind white's b pawn, so that after b6 check, king to e6, and rook to b5, he'd be able to trade rooks, go after white's doubled pawns with king to d7, and the position would be a draw. As opposed to this position where black's rook is not on b3 and there's simply no defense against the promotion of at least one of white's two passers. What's played in the game is d5, keeping watch over that b6 square, but now Magnus starts pushing his h-pawn. Dennis decides he may as well get his passer going with d4, but this allows Magnus to end the game very quickly by playing b6 with check. When after king to e4, he's now got that rook to b5, threatening promotion in two moves. Dennis executes a couple of checks with rook to g3 check, king to f2, and rook to f3 check, but after king to e1, he does of course realize that his checks are going to be running out as Magnus's king continues to flee to the west. So we have rook to f8, maybe looking to get in front of the passer, but after b7, Denis Lazovic has had quite enough, and in this position does resign the game, seeing that after rook to b8, there's simply no defense against the advancing of white's a-pawn, and no way for black to push his pawn through. So what a performance that was. Magnus truly is the endgame GOAT. Let me know in the comments if you agree, or if you don't agree, and while you're doing so, if you're enjoying this video, do consider a subscription to the channel so you don't miss any of my regularly posted content. But moving on to our third and final game, this one is between Magnus Carlsen and none other than his beloved wife Ella, aka Ella Bella Bang Bang on chess.com, who with the white pieces does open this 10-minute rapid game with e4. Magnus replies with the godfather of all openings, the Sicilian defense. Ella knows to put the horse head on f3, supporting a pawn push to d4, but after knight to c6 from Magnus, she first throws in a relatively rare move, bishop to c4. Which isn't really bad, but most strong players prefer to wait and see how black is going to proceed before committing their bishop to a square such as this. Magnus makes immediate use of this information by playing e6, just blunting the bishop's diagonal with a very well protected pawn. We now have the thematic d4, a pair of pawns come off the board, knight to f6 attacks e4, knight to c3 defends. Magnus now attacks the defender with bishop to b4, pinning it to the king. And what do you think the top engine move is here? Well, best is to simply castle, as Ella now does, which is a very impressive decision, though with her online rating of 1179, I'm not 100% convinced that she realized Magnus could pick up a pawn here with a sequence of moves that he does not play: bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and knight takes e4, for which white has ample compensation in the form of various equalizing moves, such as knight takes c6, followed by either queen to g4, hitting both knight and pawn on g7, or queen to d4, doing the same, depending on how black recaptures on c6. There's also the move bishop to a3 on the cards, holding up black from castling, so that should give you a general idea of why black doesn't have any advantage here. Magnus does not go after the pawn. He instead gets his king safely castled, at which point we have a very large and very instructive blunder with the move Ella plays next, f4, opening a diagonal to the king, and so allowing Magnus to play queen to b6, attacking the knight on d4 while pinning it to the king. And white just doesn't have a great way to defend. Knight c to e2 would of course drop the pawn on e4, for which white would have zero compensation, seeing that black is now better developed with the safely castled king. The best chance is probably e5, counterattacking the knight on f6, but after bishop to c5, pawn takes knight on f6, bishop takes knight on d4 with check, the king goes to h1, and bishop takes f6. Again, black has the extra pawn, including the two central pawns versus white's 0, so a totally winning advantage here, with the engine giving well over a pawn and a half in black's favor. What's played in the game is a move that you may already have on the brain. It's a move that I think a lot of players would want to try, bishop to e3. What could be more natural? Adding a second defender to the twice attacked knight. Of course, Magnus does have bishop to c5, adding a third attacker, but now Ella is able to play knight to a4, attacking the black queen, which wouldn't have worked on the last move, before bishop to e3 and bishop to c5 had been played, since then black could just take the knight on d4 with his queen, but here, that's no longer possible. And to the unseasoned eye, it might appear that white is the better side. Black's queen and bishop are now forked, so it seems that white is at least going to be getting the favorable knight for bishop trade out of the deal, and white would indeed be winning here, if not for a beautiful move now played by Magnus here on move 10. Go ahead and give the video a good long pause if you'd like to try and figure out what it is. Black's only winning move is bishop takes d4. There's nothing quite like giving up your queen to the queen of your life, as Magnus does here to his lovely wife Ella, who now accepts the offer with knight takes b6. When after bishop takes e3 check, king to h1, and the recapture on b6, Magnus has emerged with the 3 minor pieces for his queen. So materially, we have approximate equality, but positionally, black is the much preferred side, since queens are known to be much more effective in endgame scenarios, or at least in open positions where they can fly all over the board and wreak all kinds of havoc, as opposed to this rather innocuous opening type position where white doesn't have anything better than the move now played by Ella, e5, attacking the knight on f6. Magnus drops it into e4, threatening to come into f2 with a fork, which instead of defending against with an engine-approved move like queen to e1, Ella just ignores and plays bishop to d3. Now, an immediate knight to f2 check, forcing white to give up the exchange with rook takes f2, lest she lose her queen, would be a totally winning move for black here, but Magnus decides to play d5, giving Ella the chance to potentially pick up a pawn, with a sequence of moves that she does not find, but I'll go ahead and show it to you really quick. It goes e takes d6 en passant, knight takes d6, bishop takes h7 check, king takes h7, queen takes knight on d6, when after rook to d8, forcing the queen to a3, and bishop to d7, black still has a crushing position, despite the loss of a pawn and this now opened file to his king. That's how much the engine prefers having the 3 minor pieces over the queen here. Not sure if there's a really easy way to explain exactly why, without getting into specific variations, but to me, this certainly looks more promising for white than what's played in the game, where in response to her husband's pawn push to d5, Ella decides to capture the knight on e4. When after d takes e4, Magnus now has himself a powerful passer on e4, which after queen to e2 from Ella is pushed to e3, where it is very conveniently defended by his bishop. Next is rook a to d1, which looks very natural, but c3 would have probably been a better try, guarding d4, thus preventing the move Magnus plays next, knight to d4, attacking the white queen, threatening to push the pawn to e2 next, defended by the knight, forking the rooks. So we do have the capture on e3, but now comes knight takes c2, hitting the queen again. When after queen to c1 from Ella, we have knight to e3, forking the rooks. Ella moves one of them to e1. We do have the capture on f1. The rook recaptures. Magnus is now significantly up in material, having the 2 bishops and a rook for the queen. So pretty much just a mop-up job from here. We have bishop to d7, rook to d1, hitting that bishop. Rook a to c8, counter-hitting the queen, which goes to d2. Next is bishop to a4, attacking the rook. b3 blocking, rook f to d8, hitting the queen. This is just getting brutal now. We have a retreat to e2, and now a very nice finishing touch by Magnus, bishop to b5, attacking the queen again. Ella can see that taking the bishop is a no-go due to rook takes d1 with check, forcing mate, hence the retreat to e1. And what do you think is Black's quickest way to wrap up the game? What would you play here? The simplest way to settle matters is with the move now played by Magnus, rook takes d1. When after queen takes d1, he's got bishop to e3, threatening rook to c1 next, defended by the bishop, pinning and winning the white queen. And white has no defense. What's tried is queen to f3, but this of course runs into an even bigger issue with Magnus's very predictable reply, rook to c1 check, forcing mate in 2 moves, seeing that white has no way to get out of check other than blocking with the queen, as Ella now does when after rook takes f1, she finds herself in checkmate. So there you have it, Magnus Carlsen giving up his queen no less than 3 times in 1 week, and there was even another game he played against Alireza Firouzja where he traded his queen for the 2 rooks. Maybe I'll cover that one in the next video, or not. Let me know what you would most like to see next in the comments. Don't forget to consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already and want to see more content like this on a regular basis. Hit that like button as well if it feels correct. That always helps the channel grow, and I will see you next time.